Good evening and welcome to Back to Basics, Common Sense Law with yours truly, Preet Gill. For the last few episodes, we've discussed divorce. We've discussed how it affects your life, how it affects your property, how does it get distributed. We also discussed the importance of prenuptial agreements. But last episode, we discussed how does divorce affect a child. Whether or not you're married or not, these are really some serious issues, and we discussed child support. Child support is that this is one of the things that you need to figure out if you are going through a divorce. Child support is basically one parent giving money to another for the support of that child. It could be for school, it could just be for regular food and clothes, and it can even go as far as college education or extracurricular activities. So if you have a child support order against you where you have to pay, make sure you pay, because there are some serious consequences if you don't pay the child support obligation. These consequences can be criminal and they can affect your immigration status as well. The second thing that we talked about is who decides where the child lives. Now, even though our show is generally New York specific, I know that the majority of the states, if not all, generally use what's called the best interest of the child. They use this standard to decide where the child is going to live. How do they do this? They speak to neighbors, they look at which parent is with the child and takes them to the doctor's office, takes them to the extracurricular activities. They can sometimes even speak with the child itself, depending on how old this child is. They can interview teachers, doctors, grandparents, neighbors, anything that you can show that will, be an extra evidence into showing that the best interest is for the child to stay with me for the majority of the time. And sometimes they can even use that to give a parent full custody. So that's something to think about. The third thing, I know you guys are always going to hear me say this, is consult with an attorney, but this is the most important for this particular reason, because consulting with an attorney can actually help you plan on how the issues are going to be decided. So there can be steps that you can take while working with your attorney on how to save your interests. So before you take any actions, before you file that divorce petition, before you move out of the house, contact your lawyer. So now that we've discussed all these important issues about divorce and marriages and children, I want to take the opportunity to move forward. We think about landlords. What is a landlord? It's not some individual that owns thousands of buildings. You could be a landlord. There are many situations where someone owns a two-family house, they have a mortgage, they live on the first floor, and they rent it out the second. Even if you rented out one room, that makes you a landlord. And today's show, we're going to discuss what your rights are as landlords. Fun fact, if you are a landlord renting an illegal unit, that means a unit that, so if you have a two-family and you're also renting the basement as a third family, if the tenant decides that they no longer want to pay the rent and you take them to court to evict them, the court is not going to enforce that rent as a way to sort of punish you for doing something and illegally putting up an apartment for rent. So there's so many things that you should do, you shouldn't do. I have a great guest here with me today. We're going to dive right into these things, so don't go anywhere, and I'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. We're going to discuss what your rights are as a landlord today. But just remember, to my viewers out there, that we are a New York-based attorneys, and some of the things that we're going to say are very New York State specific and sometimes even very New York City specific. So, I hope the show can give you a general idea if you don't happen to live in New York and New York City, because it can still give you some things to think about if you are going through this, this issue and you find yourself in a certain predicament, and you can go with an attorney and speak with them. And always, if you have a question, please feel free to call in. You can ask your question in Hindi, in Punjabi, in English. We can translate it, and we'll do our best to give you the answer. So, we are waiting for your calls. So today with me, I have a landlord-tenant attorney, which you may remember from last week, Dustin Bowman from Shariak Bowman Anderson Gill and Kadashnikov LLP. Not only does he do matrimonial, but he also deals with a lot of landlord-tenant issues. So thank you for coming back, Dustin. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, so let's dive right in. I bought the house of my dreams, and I have extra space, and I want to rent it. So I'm coming to you. What should I do next?
Well, I think before you get a tenant is the right time to address the issues. And so the first thing you need to do is make sure you have a premises that's legal to rent out. If you don't, you subject yourself to fines and violations by governmental and quasi-governmental agencies.
What kind of, I'm sorry, what would make a premise legal? Like, how would I know that my house is legal?
Well, the first thing you would do is ask the attorney whom you use to purchase the house for a copy of their certificate of occupancy, which I think is pretty universal in every state and city. And that certificate of occupancy will list how each portion of the structure is permitted to be used. Okay. So in the case that you have a one-family house, as the name says, you're only permitted to use it as a one-family house. And if you rent out the basement as a separate dwelling for a separate family, that would be an illegal occupancy and subject yourself to fines and violations from governmental agencies.
Okay, so let's just assume that I have a legal unit that I can now rent out. So what else can I do to protect myself?
Right, so before you rent out the apartment to a prospective tenant is the only time you can actually research the issue, because once you have a tenant, it's going to be too late to research the issue. If they're a bad tenant and they're causing you problems or can't pay the rent, at that point you're looking at a proceeding that can take you anywhere between 3, 6, 8, even 12 months in some circumstances.
Wait, to evict somebody?
Right, so...
Okay. or to correct the issue?
To evict somebody, or to evict somebody is what I was speaking about.
Wow.
Right, so before you take that risk and lose the rent, which you need to pay the mortgage perhaps, you need to research who you're renting to.
And how do I research this tenant?
The number one way to research is to run a credit report, and that credit report would be to see what their credit history has been. You can also ask the tenant for different information before they rent the apartment. And the information that I would request as a landlord is a copy of their pay stub, their last year's tax returns. I would also ask for maybe a reference. And even I've heard of some landlords, if you want to be super careful, requesting an affidavit from one of the tenant's family members or employers attesting to what kind of a person they are. And in that way, you might even be able to hold the person writing the affidavit liable.
Is a credit check expensive?
So most people can't write a credit check. So in the case that I wanted to run a credit check on you, I would be unable to do so.
Okay.
But as a landlord, you're able to go online, and if you simply Google landlord credit check, you'll see lots of services for like $20 or $40. You can run a full credit check on a prospective tenant.
So basically, preparing yourself and just doing like a $25 to $30 credit check on somebody, taking the time to just go over their financials and maybe even getting this affidavit may end up saving you a lot of headache, time, and money in the long run.
That is certainly true, and that's certainly what I recommend to any prospective landlord.
Quick question while we're on the topic. So what would you recommend if, let's say, somebody wants to rent from me? I really like them, they're a couple that just, are working, but their credit is not the best. What are the suggestions that you would make as an attorney to your landlord, to the landlord?
Well, my suggestion is not to be induced to rent to a prospective tenant simply because you like them. Because of course, when you first meet your landlord, you're going to be on your best behavior.
That's true.
And I've heard lots of stories where the tenants seemed nice, and the landlord was trying to do a favor for the tenant, and that favor, of course, came back to bite them later.
So basically, treat this like a business decision. It's not like, there's people in front of you, they're humans, but you have to look at why it is that you're renting in the first place, and that is to get income. And the best income that you're going to get is probably from the person that has the most secure financial records, is basically what you're saying.
That's exactly right, Preet. Okay. And you can also request Social Security numbers at that time and bank statements. And that's really a way to check their finances. Now, in New York City, as I believe in the rest of the country, you're not able to discriminate based, of course, on race,
okay,
sexual orientation, gender, or in New York City on economic status. And so in the case that someone comes to you with a Section 8 voucher, you're not technically allowed to discriminate on that issue. So in the case that you don't want to rent to somebody, you have to make sure you have a valid, non-discriminatory reason. And that would be, again, financial statements, creditworthiness, things like this.
Does that affect every landlord? Or like, for example, if I'm renting my house and I'm a biased person, okay? I'm not, but let's just say, so do I have to then not discriminate based on those factors that you said, or is it just certain types of landlords?
No, so whether you're renting one apartment or you have 30 apartments that you're renting, you're still subject to the same rules by the New York City Human Rights Commission, as well as federal and state law.
Thank you for letting us know. That's really important because, you know, a lot of people may sometimes think, you know, everyone has a right to believe whatever they want to believe. And, you know, there's times when people may make a mistake where saying, well, I have to live with this particular person and, you know, we don't agree on this and this. Just remember that you just cannot, deny somebody the opportunity to be your tenant just because you're discriminating against, as you said, what was it,
Religion, gender, race. Sexual orientation, and economic class.
And economic class, okay, that's important. So what next?
Yeah, so next you have to make a determination about whether you want to sign a lease with this person.
Okay.
Now there are benefits and disadvantages to entering into a lease.
I just thought it was all benefits. They have a contract, I have them, you know, they're gonna pay me all this money for like a year or two. But you don't seem too certain about that.
Well, it really depends on what kind of an apartment you're renting and then what kind of a neighborhood it's in. Okay. So in the case that I had one apartment that I was renting for $5,000 or $6,000 a month, and I knew these people had enough money to pay the rent, a lease certainly would benefit a landlord insofar as they don't have to pay a broker fee, again, to find a new tenant or find a new tenant in 6 months or 8 months or 7, whatever it is. Right. However, in a neighborhood where perhaps you're having trouble finding a tenant and you have to accept somebody who has less than perfect creditworthiness or financial situation, then maybe a lease may not be the right way to go.
Why is that?
Because if you don't have a lease, then you don't have any. You don't have to wait until the end of the lease term to evict if you want to. So there is true, and perhaps we'll discuss it at a later time, that if there is a substantial violation of the lease, you can evict, but that is a long, risky process. And so if you don't have a lease, it's much easier to evict. You can just serve a predicate notice and go to housing court.
Okay, so it just depends on your, and again, is this a business decision or more of a legal decision that you would you actually give that advice to your client, like in this particular situation, maybe a lease is not a good idea, or is that something that they should decide on their own?
In the neighborhoods where the clients have premises in less desirable neighborhoods, I typically would advise not to enter into a lease, at least for the first 6 months or so.
Okay, because it frees you up basically as a landlord to not be completely, stuck with the particular individual. Okay.
Right, exactly right.
Well, what are some of the, you do this for a living, besides not paying rent, what are some of the other things that, tenants do which can annoy a landlord?
It runs the gamut, and tenants find very creative ways to annoy landlords. So there certainly can be noise complaints, damaging the premises. They could be running the water nonstop, complaining to governmental agencies about conditions that do or don't exist, not paying the rent, or failing to comply with the significant lease terms.
Okay. So what are some of the other things as a landlord? What are my rights in New York, in New York as a landlord?
Right, so you have, again, the right to rent a legal apartment to a tenant. You have the right to enter into a lease or not, and then you have the right to evict as long as there is no lease in effect. You also can put into your lease things that particularly are important to you. Okay. So in the case that you feel like you don't want a tenant to smoke, or you want the tenant to have a certain number of occupants, that could be put into the lease. But again, it's the enforcement of those terms which becomes a challenge.
So downloading like a lease from online on Google may not necessarily help you in getting what you want when the contract, right? So, okay, so I did not know that. So you can, what does a lease generally have? Like, what are some of the general provisions of a lease?
So a lease simply has to have the premises, the address of the premises, the amount of the rent and the period of the rental payments, and 2 signatures on the bottom, as well as a lease term. That's the essential components of a lease.
Okay.
I often have residential landlords who come to me and ask me to prepare a lease for them. And I tell them, even though I certainly can do so, I tell them not to do so and just go to the stationery store and buy a Bloomberg form lease for $8 or $10. It is true that when you have a larger building with more luxury apartments, that perhaps it would be advisable to get an attorney to prepare a lease. But in most situations, a Bloomberg form will do.
Okay. What about security deposits? I mean, is that something that a landlord can keep? Like, if let's say the tenant doesn't pay their rent, can they keep the security deposit as the last month's rent or no?
Well, that's a very good and timely question, Preet. Well, it's a good question because, yeah, the security deposit is not to guarantee the payment of rent, but to guarantee the condition of the apartment.
I'm so sorry. We actually have a quick phone call, so let's just take this. Hi, welcome to Back to Basics. This is Preet.
Hi, thank you for this episode. I was wondering if I was looking at a tenant and the tenant doesn't have income but can find a guarantor to pay the rent. Is that something I should accept?
Well,
did you hear that?
Yeah, I
Okay,
did.
I just want to repeat the question for the viewers. The question is that the landlord has found a tenant. The tenant does not have, is it good income or just no income?
Just doesn't have good enough income.
Does not have sufficient income, but they have a guarantor. What would you suggest in that situation?
So what a guarantor is it's a party who is not a party to the lease, neither the landlord or the tenant, who is guaranteeing the payment of the tenant.
Okay.
So you're right to say that the landlord then has recourse to the guarantor for any unpaid amounts of rent. But that isn't a landlord's only concern.
Okay.
And so, again, you can't discriminate based on someone's income or
Right.
economic status, but oftentimes with the lower income come other issues that landlords want to avoid. So I would be cautious in that situation, and I would probably decline if I felt like there was any risk at all to me. So if it was my client coming to me and asking me that question, I would likely tell them to look for another tenant.
Okay, thank you for calling. All right, so I guess we were in the middle of security deposits.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So security deposits are only for the guarantee of the condition of the apartment. So in the case that the tenant left the apartment and there was a hole in the wall, that security deposit is to guarantee repair of that, not the payment of rent. But
Okay.
the reason why it was such a timely question is the laws in New York City just changed. And so it used to be that you could accept a large security deposit, which sometimes would be used by a landlord to guarantee the payment of rents.
Okay.
But the deposit is now limited to 1 month pursuant to statute.
But sometimes landlords will say, well, you owe me security plus 3 months rent. Is that considered a large security or is that a prepayment? Like, is that what you're talking about?
No, so
Okay.
they're two different things,
Okay.
and it really
Okay.
does depend how you phrase it. So
Okay.
a landlord is allowed to request the prepayment of rents,
Okay.
but is not allowed to request more than 1 month security deposit. Again, I think that rule is peculiar to New York City
Okay.
and actually New York State and not the rest of the country.
So the advance payment of rent, let's just say it does happen, is the landlord allowed to apply that towards the very end of the term, like let's say of the lease, or do they have to apply it to the first few months?
I don't believe there's any rule that
Okay.
that requires a landlord to apply any specific rent to any specific period of time.
But what about a security deposit? Where does the landlord have to keep it? Do they have to keep it in
Right.
their own personal bank account?
So the law says that you have to keep it in a segregated, interest-bearing account. I think it's a practicality that doesn't often occur, and the recourse that a tenant has for the landlord's failure to keep the deposit in such an account is limited.
So are you entitled to the interest
Right, but
as a tenant?
There's also a great question, but I do remember when I was a younger person and rented an apartment for 6 years, I was surprised to see that the interest was 24 cents.
I know, it's small.
Right.
But do you have anything else to add with our episode today on landlord's rights?
I would just summarize by saying that a landlord should be very cautious in the beginning of a landlord-tenant relationship. Take all of the precautions that you possibly can. Get as much information from the tenant as possible. Don't rely on a broker's representations of the tenant, and do your own research on the tenant's ability to pay and past behavior to the extent possible.
Oh, you know what? Actually, really quickly, who pays the broker's fee? The landlord or the tenant?
There's no statute that
Okay.
applies to that, and
Okay.
it could be either. In New York City, the tradition is that the tenant would pay the broker's fee that is typically between 6 to 8% of the annual rent, which is a steep amount to pay indeed.
That is
But
a
there
lot, yeah.
are situations where a landlord will pay the broker's fee in order to induce a tenant.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for being on the show. Don't go anywhere because right after the break, I'll see you right back after the break. Welcome back. We had a great episode where we learned your rights as a landlord. If you're listening and you're a tenant, don't worry, we will get to you because you have a lot of rights in New York, especially in New York City. But I just want to emphasize some of the important things that attorney Dustin told us. The first thing is, if you are thinking about renting your house or your building or your island, whatever it is that you own, okay, take the time, take the $30 and do a credit search. Now, you can't do it yourself, but if you just look it up online, there are companies that can do the credit search for you. Ask for the income verification. Find out how much they make. Try to get affidavits from other people to say what kind of person they are, you know. Are they, or maybe even letters from their previous landlords may help you. If you do all of this, I'm not saying that this is going to protect you 100%, but at least now you have some information about this person. I mean, if credit card companies are doing it to you, mortgage companies are doing it to you, why are you not protecting yourself? So do the search on the tenant. The second thing is, it's not always in your best interest to enter into a lease with the tenant. Sometimes, depending on where your neighbor, you know, where your house is, there may be, especially in not bad neighborhoods, but in neighborhoods where you would think that tenants may come and go. It's, you know, the rents are a little bit lower. If you want to protect yourself, don't enter into a lease. Maybe give yourself some time. Give yourself a couple of months before you offer a lease to the tenant. Because if you're in a lease, you may be bound for a very long time, especially if that tenant is paying rent, but there may be other issues that you have. So protect yourself, know your rights, do a little bit of research, and next week we're going to talk about what happens if you do find yourself in a situation where you have to bring the tenant to what's called the landlord-tenant court. So don't go anywhere. I will see you guys next Thursday at 7:30.